Darkness tries to roll over my bones, when sorrow comes to steal the joy I own, when brokenness and pain is all I know. Oh, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Shame no longer has a place to hide, and I am not a captive to the lies, and I'm not afraid to leave my past behind. Oh, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Stand in your love. Standing in your love. Yeah. Stand in your love.
Hey Westside, it's Tyson here. It's hard to believe that September is already upon us, and I know for me personally that means moving schedules, and maybe you're feeling the same, whether that's from work or kids that are going back to school. And so while you're in the midst of that, we're glad that you would join us for another online service. Now, I just want to keep you up to date on all that's happening as we begin to move into these fall months. I want to let you know about the Sanctuary course that's beginning here. And the Sanctuary Mental Health course is a course that's going to combine clinical research, lived experience, and theological practice to help support conversations as we explore how mental health impacts our community. Now, this course is both for those who are looking for support as they navigate their own mental health, and it's also for those who are seeking to understand how to participate as part of a supportive community. Now, this course is going to run in person here at Westside King's Church on Wednesday evenings from 7 to 8:30 p.m. beginning on September 8th. Now, it's important to note that registration is required and space is limited for this course. And so if you have any questions regarding it, feel free to email Kristen Woods at cwoods@wkc.org. Now, registration for the Sanctuary course, as well as to stay up to date on all of our programming throughout the fall months as they become available, you can head to our website at wkc.org/menu.
In John chapter 12 and verse 32, Jesus says the following. He says, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to me. Now, the wider conversation in the passage in John chapter 12 is about glory and exaltation. And at first glance, Jesus appears to be saying that if he gets the glory, then everyone will come to him. Which, as much as it sounds like the strategy behind pretty much every political campaign and social media influencer, it's a little jarring, perhaps a little surprising, to hear Jesus engage in what sounds like a power grab. Now, if there's something that this pandemic has taught me, it's that power is a difficult subject. The question of who is actually in charge, the question of whether those in charge act the right way. Sometimes the question about whether any of us would want to be in charge. And those in charge often find that actually being in charge requires them to make tough and difficult decisions that are not always welcomed and not always liked. Politicians, medical officers, scientists, managers, etc., etc. Anyone who has any level of authority, particularly in our current moment in culture, is immediately treated with suspicion. And the suspicion around power isn't something that's developed during this pandemic. It actually reflects something of our conflicted nature as humans. Now think about it. We don't respect weak leaders, but we also don't like the way so-called strong leaders use their power. So often our cultural moment that we're in has decided that what we'll do is just protest the idea of power entirely. Any discussion of power is a power play, we say. So therefore, power must be the thing that's wrong, right? Biblically, this is challenging for us as Jesus followers, because on page 1 of the Bible, we find this text, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. It says, God blessed the humans, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Like, whoa, language of subdue and dominate. You notice it does kind of one of two things for many of us. For some people, we hear the language of subdue and dominate, and that gives us permission, like permission to behave or do certain things. And for other people, that language causes us to recoil, perhaps trauma from our past or just our understanding of things that we become quite uncomfortable when we hear people talk about dominion. Now, at some level, the Old Testament is a narrative navigating the broken attempts by humans to deal with the demands of power. At some level, the question is, how do we lead in a godly way? A regular theme as to how the Bible in the Old Testament deals with this is to talk about wisdom. The biblical writers know that power can be dangerous and difficult for everyone, and therefore wisdom is presented as the solution. It's tough and difficult to know how to deal with power as a broken human. So what humans do is they request and they add wisdom, particularly the type of wisdom that comes from God. So books like the Proverbs, for example, speak to this all the time. We need wisdom in order to act and behave properly. And the famous King Solomon becomes a sort of parabolic example of this. Solomon has lots of wisdom. This wisdom is granted to him by God. But if he stops listening to this wisdom, then his power starts to become destructive. So wisdom kind of tries to hold power in check. But I wonder if the challenge perhaps is not one of definitions. What do we mean by power? What do we mean by subdue? What do we mean by dominion? Like, do we tend to take those terms, assume that we understand them, and then apply them accordingly whenever we find ourselves in power, and sort of feel biblically justified in doing that? And the biblical evidence suggests that, yes, that is what humans have done historically. Here's what we understand we're called to do, and now here we're going to do it. Which leads to ask this question. What does dominion, or what does the idea of to dominate, mean to you? And the answer to that question is actually found in Scripture. Interestingly, in the Psalms, the public songbook of the people of Israel. And there's something fascinating about songs that would be sung repetitively being the place where the definition of domination is presented to us. In Psalm 72, the songwriter lays out the role of a king. So Psalm 72 is a royal psalm, and it describes a king and how a king should be. Essentially, Psalm 72 is a description of what good power looks like. Verse 8 of the psalm, it says this: "May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." So this king is going to have lots of dominion. But then listen carefully to this. Firstly, the request is that this king, this good king, have dominion. But then notice in verse 12 of Psalm 72, it says this: "For he," that's the king, "delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the life of the needy. From oppression and violence, he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight." Now, here's the question. Does this model of dominion fit the paradigm that we see elsewhere? Because the psalm talks about this king who has dominion, but then when it describes what that dominion looks like, it's care for the vulnerable, it's care for the outcast and the poor and the downtrodden. Like, the biblical commentary seems to be creating a tension between the ideal and the actual. You see, the kings of Israel, this psalm is about the king of Israel, but the kings of Israel were notorious for their abuse of power. And you might listen and think, well, it didn't really stop there, did it? That's just what kings were like. And so what we see in Psalm 72 is a redefinition, a clarification perhaps, of what it means to hold power. Power and authority is given for the benefit of those without power, for the weak and the vulnerable. Is this the Bible's model of power? And perhaps I might even ask, is it a surprise that the Bible even offers us a model of power? So initially then, it seems that Psalm 72 is implying that power, while God intended, isn't actually the problem. Rather, power has become another distorted echo. It should point us towards God's way for the world. But instead, it becomes corrupted by greed and abuse. So dominion can actually be a good thing if dominion speaks to the care for the vulnerable and the ignored. So, circle back round for a moment then to the text that I opened with in John 12 and 32. Jesus said, "When I'm lifted up from the earth, I'll draw all people to me." So is Jesus making a power play here? Is he living in the standard mode of anyone that has authority of saying, make me the one everybody looks at, and then everybody will come alongside and follow me? But the language choice in this passage in John 12:32 is interesting. Because while the whole passage is talking about glorification and exaltation, and the language of being lifted up in the time of Jesus was a way of describing those things, throughout the whole of John's gospel, this language has been used in a very nuanced way. So if you start at John 1, read right the way through to John 21, what you'll notice is that the language of glorification, particularly of Jesus' glorification, is very specifically used. And you actually see in the gospel Jesus being glorified. It happens when he's crucified. Or perhaps when he is lifted up from the earth. You see, because to be lifted up was a shorthand of a way of being crucified. There's a way to talk about that. So the sort of twist of John's gospel is that you do see Jesus be glorified in the text. but it just doesn't look like what we expect glorification to be. So the cross is the moment of exaltation of Jesus, but it's an inversion of how we must understand power, authority, glory, and exaltation. Tom Wright frames it well in his book, Broken Signposts. He gives us this thought like this. He says, when, with the world in ruins, that entry of God as human into the world necessitated the most dramatic inversion imaginable of the normal concepts of power. Jesus coming into his kingdom through the shameful torture of the cross. So when that happens, we begin to glimpse that part of our problem with theology itself is that we have projected back onto God the various images of power we have gleaned from its abuse, rather than allowing the vision of God displayed in the Gospels to reorient and realign all that we might want to say about God in the first place. Wright continues to say, the whole New Testament insists that we only know who God really is, and with that we only know what power really is, by looking at Jesus himself. So what Tom Wright's doing with this quote and guiding us towards is that he's taking the biblical cue and suggesting that we use Jesus as the model of power to reorient and realign our own use of power. So you don't take your idea of power and try to make sense of Jesus, but rather take what the Bible shows you about Jesus and use that to reorient your understanding of power. It's about getting everything in the right order. So, to see how Jesus models that clearly, if we want to see it clearly, there are two texts that I think we can jump to briefly today. The first text keeps us in John's Gospel, and that's at John chapter 13. And it may even be a familiar text to you because it happens on the night before Jesus is crucified. It's a moment in the Christian tradition that's celebrated on Maundy Thursday. John chapter 13 and verse 2, it reads like this. It says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that's why he said not everyone was clean. So when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Like, whoa, it's quite a text if you think about it. It's got a lot going on there in that text. Here we have Jesus the night before he's about to be crucified, and this is the story that we focus on. And what I want to do is just highlight a couple of moments in the narrative for you that are important to kind of connect to our teaching around questions of power today. Firstly, Notice that the story begins with an assertion from the author that all things are under Jesus' power. And it's quite a big statement there. But then, this position of authority, the fact that all things are under Jesus' power, forms the basis of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And now, you possibly can pick up with this. Most people can infer it from the context, but washing feet in those days was lowly work. It was not the work for the powerful. And to be honest with you, even nowadays, like if I said go and wash someone's feet, that's not something you would overly want to do. Symbolically, it inverts expectations. It's definitely not what you expect from the boss. But there is a question as we read this text. Is Jesus just acting symbolically? Or is this actually what power and leadership looks like for Jesus? Let me ask the question a little bit more like this. Is Jesus just showing that he's not above serving? Or is he showing that this is actually what it is to have power? And this to me seems like an important definition. A leader who just occasionally does the dishes is not the same as what Jesus is doing here. He's not just making a point saying, well, I'm not above this. He's actually showing us how to lead. The second thing is at the end of the passage. So look at the start and jump to the end of the passage for a moment. Notice that here, Jesus references himself as Lord and teacher. He says, you call me Lord and teacher. This is true. Curiously though, this is the only time in John's entire gospel that Jesus refers to himself as Lord. So what do you think it says about power if the only time we hear Jesus use this title of himself is here when he's on his knees in a towel having washed feet? There are many other examples you might expect to see Jesus be called Lord. When he does a great miracle, when he heals somebody, when he feeds 5,000 people, when he offers some brilliant reasoning or theological insight, when somebody proclaims him as the Messiah. But no, the only time that Jesus says, you're right to call me Lord, is in this moment of serving. And so Jesus then expands this to say that not only is this what he's doing, washing the disciples' feet, but this is the example he expects us to follow. And of course, there's something going on here where this is bigger than just do we wash feet or not. We take a text like this completely literally and we miss the point. That Jesus is trying to help us see that how he leads has a serving process to it. And this then helps us make sense of the third observation, which is the interaction in the middle of the story between Peter and Jesus. Now, Peter is uncomfortable having Jesus wash his feet. And socially, I kind of expect you to understand that. I get it. Like, oh, this is icky, Jesus. I'm not sure I like this. But where is Peter's discomfort coming from? Well, on one level, there's having any peer do this to you would be uncomfortable. But then it's made even more uncomfortable by having your Lord or Master do this. So Peter wants to draw away from this because it's almost as if Peter's saying, I don't like the way this power structure is working here. I can't really make sense of this. This doesn't look right. But notice now Jesus' reply. And Jesus says to Peter, essentially, if you want to be part of what I'm doing, Peter, then you need to redefine your notions of power. Peter, if you're going to be part of this kingdom, you've got to be comfortable with power looking like this. And that's where this story echoes through to us today. You see, because it's one thing to believe in Jesus, but have we sometimes simply spiritualized what that means? And therefore, are we sometimes unwilling to consider how following Jesus shapes something as fundamental as our understanding of power? Jesus seems to be saying to Peter, you can't be part of this unless you're willing to think more broadly, more widely about what it looks like to live life as a Jesus follower. Which kind of makes me want to ask this question. Is Jesus simply offering us an example of what leadership looks like in a Christian setting? So it's like, hey, this is what pastors look like, or this is what Christian leaders look like. Or is Jesus modeling how Christians should lead, period? Because on one level, the idea of a leader serving, it's kind of common to see this as expected for church leaders, for Christian leaders, for pastors, for example. This is, yeah, of course, this is how they should lead. But what about a car salesperson or a corporate manager, a financial director? What does it look like to hold power in a Jesus way if you work in acquisitions or debt collection? Should investors on the stock market lead in this way too? And all of a sudden, the picture of Jesus in the towel becomes a little complex for us. I don't have the answers to that question that I just put to you. There's actually not an easy answer here. But I wonder if John 13 works as an invitation to wrestle with a vision that Jesus has of what does power actually look like. Not when it's neat and tidy in a church setting, but what does it look like to live with this understanding of power in our day-to-day life. And at which point then, there's one more text that we want to look at. I said there was two. And the second text is over in Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. And here, in Mark chapter 10, Jesus encounters his disciples arguing about status, about glory, and about power. These disciples are and they come to Jesus and they offer him a question about all of that. And Jesus responds by giving them a comparison between his leadership and the power examples that they have kind of grown up with, what they've seen everywhere else. So Mark chapter 10 and verse 42 has Jesus quoted like this. It says, Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the other nations, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be servant of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." Not to be served, but to serve. Like, there's the model. There is the model that Jesus offers. If you find yourself with power and authority, you can lord it over, or you can serve. But Jesus says only one of these ways is the way of Jesus. Only one of these ways is the way in which Jesus has saved the world. So what we see is that Jesus reveals to us a different way. A way of power that's rooted in being self-giving, in serving and loving. And this is how Jesus intends us as his followers to influence our worlds, our cultures, our contexts, our friendship groups, our neighbors. And I fundamentally believe that Jesus doesn't just mean the church. Jesus did not come just to give us a model as to how to do church really well. Yes, the church should model the way of Jesus. But the reason that we want to model the way of Jesus as the church is for the rest of our lives, not just for Sundays. And I think that's a challenge for us as the people of Jesus. It's a challenge for us as the church to navigate how often we've gotten this wrong. You see, it's not simply that we've not modeled this way outside of the church, outside of Sundays, but that often we've forgotten to model the way of Jesus even within our own communities. So what then happens is that we, in the kind of complexity of being the church, find ourselves often looking elsewhere to find our models of Jesus. While ironically, Some of these external models of leadership are beginning to connect the way of Jesus with the right way to be. It becomes quite messy at some level. In fact, recently I noticed that Simon Sinek, in his book Leaders Eat Last, he said this: the true price of leadership is the willingness to place the needs of others above your own. Great leaders truly care about those they are privileged to lead and understand that the true cost of leadership, privilege, comes at the expense of self-interest. At which point you think, well, wait a minute, this book that I bought off the shelf at Chapters seems to be talking to me about the way of Jesus that we see in John chapter 13, the way of Jesus that we see in Mark chapter 10. But a way that we so often fail to see in our own Christian lives. So, is part of the challenge for us not simply to model the way Jesus handled power to our culture and our society, but actually to model it to each other and to ourselves? Is the inversion of power that Jesus showed us one that we easily forget and need to be constantly reminded of, much like the kings in the Old Testament? We can get so easily off track and lose definition as to what Jesus intended us to understand by power. So, may you feel the call to wrestle with how you understand power. It may not be easy, it may not be straightforward. Your context, your culture, your career may not make it easy to do things differently. But may you hear that call and wrestle with it anyway. May you see Jesus and his cross as the lens through which you understand more than just salvation, but how you behave. That you're thankful to the cross, not just because of the relationship it creates for you and Jesus, but because it becomes the frame through which you see everything. And may you find what your towel is and learn how to serve those who you are called to serve. And may his grace and peace be with you.